Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And hello, Jane. How are
Hello,
you?
Andrew. Good to be back.
Yeah, great to see you again. And really looking forward to diving in and picking up where we left off, which we were going to go into characters, weren't we? Oh, sorry, Oscar. Character. I slapped my cat. Sorry, it was an accident. Um,
Was
yeah, we were going to look into the characters and how they've been
yes.
portrayed in both films and how fair, because I know some of it was a bit controversial, especially in the more recent film.
Yeah. And I actually wanted to go into that with you, Andrew, because you already mentioned some amazing ones there. I mean, we have, just to mention a few, we have, of course, Captain Smith. We talked about him a little bit. We have Ismay, who is, I guess, portrayed a little controversial, at least in the 97 version. We also have Thomas Andrews
Yeah.
in both films. We have the famous Molly Brown. We have someone like Murdoch, and you touched on him as well, Andrew. And I maybe we should actually start with the crew because I know you have not been too happy about the Titanic version of him. Is that right?
Murdoch, no. When I walked out of the cinema in '97, I loved the film overall. I thought, barring some things, they'd done a pretty good job. The one thing I did not like was how they treated the character of Murdoch. So my two objections to the way they portrayed him in the film, one, was that he had even considered taking the bribe from Cal.
Ah,
Because in terms of what people say about Murdoch and the way he has been remembered in most, if not all, of the literature, he was the sort of character who would have thrown the money right back in Cal's face at the start rather than just letting him stick it in his pocket. And even more offensively is the bit where he discharges his weapon into the crowd and hits and kills Fabrizio, but then turns the gun upon himself. Now, shots were definitely fired on that night, mainly to drive men back from the lifeboats when they were getting in before, trying to rush the boats. But although there are some very lurid stories among men about men being shot, none of them have ever been substantiated. It's all probably hearsay. There was one account that claimed that both Smith and Murdoch had committed suicide in different ways, but again, there's absolutely no evidence for this. And many more witnesses say that when they last saw Murdoch, he was getting people into the boats. He was, being a professional. He was doing what he was supposed to be doing. So I think the filmmakers were really reaching when they used Murdoch's character that way, and they were on extremely dodgy ground. And I remembered some of his descendants had got quite cross, and there'd been a huge complaint, and I think Cameron had to apologise, quite rightly, for the misrepresentation of Murdoch.
I guess.
And
Sorry, go on, Andrew.
Oh no! And apparently, he made a very generous donation to a local primary school that had a Murdoch Prize for outstanding achievement because he's very well regarded in his hometown and he's very well thought of, unsurprisingly.
Yeah.
So yeah, the treatment of Murdoch was very subpar, I thought, and I don't think they needed to do that because we already know by that point in the film what a crooked person Cal is. You don't really have to layer it on that thick, and you don't. And if you were going to do something like that, far better to bribe a nameless mid-level officer who would say, "I'll see what I can do, Governor." That
Yes.
sort of thing. Far
I,
less controversial.
yeah. No, I'm very much with you. I think if it was panic you wanted to show and the panic that could have gripped everyone, you didn't need to use a historical character. As you say, you could have chosen a nameless one who did something crazy,
Hmm.
whether it be a part of the passengers or crew. There wasn't really any need to use someone who was already well liked and well known and where you knew that it's probably going to be a bit of questions around this.
Yeah.
Um, and it I guess in a way, I would have rather liked a deeper portrayal of those crew members than I needed the love story that much. And I realized creating a fictional love story was very much, I guess, a product of the time as well, because that was probably what you needed to sell a film back in the 90s. So I guess we had that narrative kind of going on, but you could have done it and dialed it down a bit and got some actual amazing portraits of crew members out of this as well, because we don't dive into a lot of them that well. We get an impression of Captain Smith, we get an impression of Mr. Andrews and of Ismay, but there are crew officers, especially, where you think, goodness, it could have been wonderful and really interesting to hear more about their perspective in all of this. And even if you look sort of below the bridge, where you got in the communication, you got those two guys sitting there sending out the SOS and that kind of thing. Just imagine, what we do get glimpses of all of that, and of course all the way down to the men working with the coal and all of that. But it would have been a little nicer to dive into some of those, perhaps.
Yes, yes. I was glad that I mean, looking at the very bottom of the ship's social hierarchy, I was glad that the Stokers got
Yes.
at least a little bit of representation. Um, and actually, it was positive for the most part. The only time any of them really speak, other than when the ship's first getting underway and they're saying, "Come on, lads, put your back into it," is when Jack and Rose are running through the boiler room, which they really should not have been doing. And one of them says, "You can't be here; it's dangerous." So it's, there's that concern and fellow feeling. It's very. But then the last time you see any of them is when the watertight doors are closing, and then they just vanish. The rest of the disaster happens and the Stokers just vanish. And the film did miss a trick, because there were some very, very brave people in boiler rooms 4 and 5 who were trying to keep things going as long as they could. And they only really abandoned the place when the pumps were failing and the sea was really starting to come in. And a few others sort of left a bit earlier and tried to make their way up to boat. I mean, you get the whole spectrum of behavior from the Stokers, going all the way from incredibly gallant and remaining at their posts as long as they can, to interesting. You mentioned the two wireless operators. One of them, he was so fixated on trying to send the last message, he didn't notice a Stoker apparently was trying to steal his life jacket, and luckily his friend Bride was still in the room and jumped the guy, and they managed to stop him. So it's the whole run of human behavior, from the finest to the worst. And I think, yes, if the film had dialed back, as you say, on Jack and Rose, they could have fleshed out so many more of these really interesting stories. It's interesting how much is given to Jack and Rose. So, where they see Andrews in the lounge, just accepting his fate. When Rose asks him, "Are you not even going to make a try for it, Mr. Andrews?" Apparently, I think historically it was one of the stewards who asked him that.
Because we get that scene, don't we, in A Night to Remember?
Yeah.
It's almost two identical scenes. I think the question is even the same. But yes, you're right. Rose is saying it or asking him in Titanic, and I cannot remember who it is in A Night to Remember. But the scene is almost identical, and he's standing there with the clock and kind of accepting that this is happening now. And I actually want to ask you, Andrew, about Mr. Andrews, because how much do we know about him?
I don't know very much about him personally, but his professional qualifications, he was a pretty well-regarded naval architect. He'd been responsible for a very large part of the design of the Olympic class. And to be fair to Andrews, I mean, his reputation shouldn't really be sullied by the Titanic disaster, because when you look at Olympic, she goes on to have an absolutely stellar career. surviving 2 world wars in the process, and the storm of protest when she was finally broken up. Loads of people wanted her to be preserved as a museum ship.
I remember.
But as ever, lots of people make noise. But when you say open your wallets, oh no, no, no. But yeah, so she was his creation, and this was a ship that was arguably slightly inferior to Titanic. So it's not a problem with the thing; it's more a problem with the circumstances. But judging by his behavior on the night, I find him quite an incredible character. So you he did go around helping people as much as he could. I think he was mainly advising people on what to do, where to go, reminding those who didn't have life jackets to put them on. Um, they don't really show him doing that in the 1997 film. I think the closest he comes to it is giving Rose his own life jacket. But yeah, that's a side of him that I think is incredibly admirable. But he was clearly burdened by a sense of guilt about what was happening, and also the knowledge he had that most people were not going to be saved, because he could do maths better than most on that ship, and he completely understood the situation with the lifeboats, and I think he makes it. Oh, sorry, Jane.
I was just imagining standing there with that knowledge and knowing, okay, so and so long to go. If we're lucky, so and so long to go. And remaining calm in that. I think you're right, Andrew. The guilt must have been unbearable in that situation, perhaps because of his knowledge.
Yes, yes, and also the fact that to avoid a panic. I think this was because in the last video we talked about the very slow sense of danger, and which of course down to the very slow dissemination of information. It's all about avoiding a panic. So don't send stewards running through the ship going, "Oh my God, we're sinking." Just get people assembled, tell them as much as they need to know. In some cases, don't tell them anything at all. Just tell them where to go. And
we do see there is a tiny scene in the 97 version where he's going on deck and he's talking to some of the people lowering the lifeboats, and he says, where are all the passengers? And I think one of the officers says, "Oh, they're still inside, sir. It's too cold for them out here." And you can see his panic rising. So there was a clear, and maybe this is from historical accounts as well. There was at least try and get as many as possible away from here, kind of feeling in him.
yeah, the one thing, and yes, it's a good moment in the film. And there's the other one where he collars, I think it's Lightoller, about why some of the boats are being lowered half empty. And he reminds him that they were tested in Belfast with the weight of 65 adult males. So these davits can do it, man. Just get the boats filled. But yes, it's unfortunate because you've got what he knows, and it clashes with the sea experience of a lot of the officers on the ship, where you don't necessarily load a lifeboat before because there are dangers inherent in doing that. But I think either they didn't read the memo or they didn't realize that it was something Titanic's system was capable of. But yes, I have read in accounts about people drifting back into the superstructure because it was bitterly cold outside, and standing there watching a group of people who may not entirely know what they're doing, trying to ready a boat for launching, is probably not the most fun thing to be doing on a cold Atlantic night. Yeah, no, poor Mr. Andrews. I've always felt very sorry for him. I think he was.
There's almost a shared destiny with the captain, isn't there? They kind of, both of them decide, they make a decision effectively, both of them, maybe as the only two.
Yeah. Captain Smith is an interesting one. He's a hugely respected figure in the company. And of course, it was his final voyage before he was due to retire, poor man. He had unfortunately demonstrated a penchant for crashing liners into things because he'd commanded Olympic before Titanic, and she'd collided with a Royal Navy cruiser, HMS Hawke. Now, to be fair, it wasn't Smith's fault, or debatably not Smith's fault. If you follow the rules of the road, it was, it's very telling. Hawke's bow was smashed in, and Olympic had a big hole in her side. So, as to the question of whose driving was bad, yeah. Yeah, and also technically Hawke could turn a tighter circle than Olympic could. So, it's circumstances, I think. But no, poor Smith, he was a very experienced man. And I think I said in the previous video, to be completely fair to him, he hadn't even been on duty when the ship struck the berg. So that's the worst thing for a captain.
Yeah.
A lot is made of that conversation, which I think they really play on in the 1997 film, where Ismay's going, "Come on, Smith, crank up to 24 knots. You know you want to. Yeah, let's arrive a day early and give the newspapers something to talk about." Now, I think, to be completely fair, people have used that to transfer a lot of blame onto Ismay. But at the end of the day, and this was a very accepted convention at the time, no matter what the director of your company said, when the ship was at sea, you're the captain. The decision is ultimately yours. And if you want to, you can politely, 1912 style, tell him what to go do with himself and that suggestion. And yeah, Oscar agrees with me. I think he agrees with me. I tell myself he agrees with me. And you could get endlessly knotted in the politics of whether that would be a career-ending move. But again, it's his last voyage, so his career's almost over anyway. So there's never a better time to tell the manager of your company what to go and do with himself.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. There was something a little unrealistic, I think, about that in the 97 version, because Captain Smith, as you rightly say, Andrew, he was no novice. He's been in the game for a long time. Would he have been pushed by someone who just wanted to, meet the morning papers a day earlier?
No, I
don't know how vain he might have been, and there's always, but there is just something in that conversation where you go, really, could you have done that with someone like Captain Smith?
I personally feel no, although I know many people will disagree with me with equal validity, because we've got so many accounts of Smith, but you can never really know how a person will react. And he never left a final diary entry, in his jacket pocket saying, "Talk to Ismay, decided to go 24 knots because it will make me look awesome." And so
both films actually, and again, nearly identical scenes, have him in the lifeboat, and he's kind of he turns around and he looks away just as Titanic is sinking. They're almost identical scenes in both films, and I know you can interpret it in many ways. And I think in the 50s version, he wasn't made out as quite the villain as he was in the 97 version. But I think because he survived, and that alone maybe put him up for a lot of blame.
He wasn't the only one. It's yes, surviving almost became a criminal act once people got over the immediate ramifications of the disaster. And actually, I'm ashamed to say that when I was a younger, angrier person, around the time I watched the movie, in fact, I really was in the J. Brute Ismay camp. Because most of what I'd read at the time would, really pilloried him and made him out to be the worst human being alive. As the years wore on, actually, because the film did rekindle my interest in looking into Titanic, I realized that he committed the cardinal sin of surviving and getting into a boat when he had a chance to, but they do ignore the fact that he did try to help. Yeah, and even at one point, although one of the ship's officers yells at him to stop meddling because he's helping but not helping, but even then he goes off still trying to herd people into boats, or to try and help impose some order on the situation. Because the thing is, with Ismay, and it's picked up in Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember, is that his position is really anomalous on the Titanic, because he's sort of an employee because he's the manager of the White Star Line, but he's also not an employee because he's traveling as a passenger, and he himself seems to go effortlessly from one to the other. And so you never quite know when Ismay's talking to you or doing something with you, whether he's being a passenger or a company employee, if I can call him that. And it's very tricky. I think through most of the period between the collision and the sinking, he was trying to be an employee and not doing it very successfully, but he was trying. And my feeling about him now, I don't know how you feel about him, is that, if given what the situation was like, if someone does his best and then their courage fails at the 11th hour, they won't really get much blame from me, because I've never been in a situation like that and I've got no idea how I would behave.
He is an interesting one, but I do remember reading there were articles that were really critical about him. And as you say, Andrew, it might have been that simply surviving is more or less a crime, and certainly not, helping if you were suffering from survivor's guilt, which is bad enough. This wouldn't help at all. So he must have had a very, very difficult time.
I yes, I think he did, and I think we'd said in earlier he did right after the disaster. He basically does his best to vanish from public view. He just sort of caves in on himself. I think he doesn't even answer a lot of the criticism. He just doesn't want to engage, and
in a way, you can understand that for many reasons, but also if you do, you kind of have to keep doing that for the rest of your life. So for however long you were going to live, Titanic is going to be part of you. You couldn't really do anything else with your life after that.
no, indeed, and if it was survivor's guilt that was plaguing him, then he was cursed with a very long life, because I don't think he died till the 1930s. He lived a long time afterwards.
He did. He did. I don't know how old he was at the time, but he did. He did go on for a bit. Andrew, there was another scene that I wanted to discuss with you as well, which is the actual sinking moment. Just around the time when it breaks,
Yeah,
where Titanic breaks, and because there was a very good point I remember watching in a documentary about with quite a few testimonials, where if you had been on the ship, it would have felt as if it was almost in an upright position, but
yeah,
it probably wasn't. It probably was, at a bit of an angle, but it must have felt like the entire ship went upright in that moment. And I think that was a good point. And in Titanic from 97, it's basically upright and then it sinks.
yeah.
In A Night to Remember, it's at a bit of an angle and then slowly goes down. But kind of a good little technical point there, and again a difference between what this would have looked like from the lifeboats and what it would have felt like for people still on board Titanic towards the very last minute there. And then, of course, we have that thing about keeping morale up, and we have the two orchestras there again in each movie playing.
Yeah.
And again, I think actually A Night to Remember has the correct version or the correct melody of Nearer Thy God to Thee. And the Titanic version is using a slightly later melody. There are two different melodies to that hymn, but still, very poignantly done. And I guess all of that is something we know from testimonials, isn't it? We don't have like accounts from that, do we? In other senses.
No, it's all down to, so because of course you rightly mentioned the band, and none of them survived, so it's really just people who saw them in action. And there was even a bit of debate about what they were playing at the very end, because I think it's ragtime and cheerful tunes until they move to hymns.
Yes.
And I like how the 97 film captured the handover point where I think one of them makes a comment of, well, they never listened to us anyway, which is so poignant in that situation. And then they reassemble of their own volition and just carry on. Then it becomes the religious music. Yes, because I think some of the survivors claimed they were playing Autumn, which was an alternate Episcopalian hymn, but I think that was only one account that said it was Autumn, and a couple of the others say it was Nearer My God to Thee. There's also questions about the order, but I don't hold it against people when you're panicking and in that situation. I was like, what order did they play the songs in? It's really important right now.
But I think that the point is that they did it
Yes.
as you say, that was, what can we do? We can play.
Yeah.
What could we possibly do in this moment? Which is another layer of that drama, and
Yeah.
that's added to that. But both of them really wonderful scenes, and we do get to see that in both movies. And then also in both movies, we get glimpses of the people in the lifeboats who are looking in horror at what's
Mm.
going on, and the screams and everything, and the people landing in the water. And then, of course, this entire thing of going back or not.
Yeah, yeah. There's and it resonates so much as the theme because at the time there was a lot of criticism again in the aftermath where the I don't think you really see them much in the 1997 movie, but the Duff Gordons and their boat, they get away with 12 people in that boat, and that's really like and then they don't go back because there's a lot of fear that and like Ismay, the Duff Gordons had to spend the rest of their life living down the accusation that they'd got away almost in their own personal boat with a couple of other survivors.
Yeah.
And Molly Brown in gets into that shouting match with her coxswain, doesn't she? Like, should go back, and like, no, they'll swamp us. It was a very real fear. And also Lowe, the one played by Ewan Griffith in the 1997
Yeah.
film, he is the only one to go back, as that film says. But the one thing they leave out, interestingly, is that he was trying to reorganize his boats, but he was also deliberately waiting. And this may sound a bit cold-blooded. He wanted the number of swimmers to thin out a bit because he was also afraid that there'd be a human tidal wave and that they'd lose a boat. Now, tragically, as it happened, he waited far too long. And you can sort of see it in the actor's face where he's saying, we waited too long and there's no one left alive here.
I do love
Uh,
that scene, actually. I think it's very well put together. And and
yeah.
and also the panic in him as he starts to realize that, oh my God, are we going to find anyone alive?
Yes, yes. The pendulum swings. It's like, no, I'm not going to face a human tidal wave. Actually, I've just come in time to, and I do. It probably would have been too shocking for 1950s audiences. I know they convey the horror of all that in A Night to Remember really, really well. But I don't know whether it's just something worse about seeing it in color because to us it makes it so much more real. The really awful bit is when they're shining the light around and you see the dead mother with the baby, and you just think, oh my God, that's it really, really hits hard, that one.
Some of them, in this cold water, some of those sort of stiffened faces, in stiffened in horror,
Yes.
and you wouldn't have survived for very long in that water. It would have been like maybe just above freezing point, but you wouldn't have survived for very long, whether or not you had been in the water or just wet and on a door.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, if you were young and fit and were doing everything you could to keep warm, I'd give most people half an hour tops on average. A lot of the older, more vulnerable people would have been dead within 10 minutes, I think.
A baby, yeah, a baby less so.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been possible. But it was scary, just the number of people who were rescued after, from the water. That was such a low number. This was
Yeah.
a graveyard of 1,500 people.
Yeah. Yeah. The only person who seems to have set an incredible record for staying alive in the water was our dear friend Baker Joan, who the boat he swam to was too crowded. And according to his account and someone else's, a friend of his on the boat didn't want him to drift away. They didn't want him to get on because he would swamp it, but they didn't want him to swim away either. So he stretched out his arm and Joan took it. And so he was holding on to his friend's hand with one hand and treading water frantically with the other. And I think between the whiskey and the constant exercise, it seems to have kept him alive.
Maybe there's something to whiskey. We don't know. But yes. But oh my goodness me. Andrew, as we're trying to wrap up, I wanted to ask you as well, are there aspects or maybe scenes from either movie that you feel have impacted you the most, positively or negatively? What sort of left the biggest impression with you?
From both films, I think in both films, I like the moments before it all starts going wrong, because as displays of life in a now vanished era, I find it fascinating. And I'm very much a fan of the now very popular idea that a ship is a floating community with nuances, but a liner particularly because it's carrying a cross section of society. And Titanic, because she was such a prominent ship, is as good a time capsule of that era as any. And I know that Night to Remember starts the clock a bit closer to the hitting the iceberg. So in a sense, I think the '97 film maybe has an edge. The other thing I like is and Cameron said he was trying to capture this. He was trying to get into the Edwardian celebration of technological marvels. So when the ship's leaving Southampton, you get the stirring music, Horner at his best, and you get these beautiful camera angles. And I think that there's the one sweeping shot around the ship where you can see the tiny figures walking around, and I believe that was a mix of a model and the figures added by CGI, but it was really early. But I've never forgotten seeing that in the cinema and thinking, "Oh my goodness! If White Star, if White Star could have had that as an advertisement at the time, it would have blown people away." And it is nice because despite the disaster, and we all know what's going to happen really when we watch the film, it does remind you of an age that was full of these marvels that people had never seen. Humans were just beginning to fly. People were building bigger and bigger ships capable of better things. There were more gadgets ashore that people could become affordable. I like the fact that they have a guy with a cinereal camera recording the ship leaving.
Yeah.
There were all these things coming into people's lives that were so full of wonder and spectacle. And I think we've slightly lost that in the present day and age. So I was so glad that the film captured it. But sorry, I've run away a bit with that one. Jane, over to you. Same question.
They're fantastic points, and you're right about everything. And you're right about that sheer marvel that we've kind of forgot. We're so used to being able to recreate everything digitally or virtually or in AI nowadays that we're not really amazed anymore. And there's something that's a little sad about that we just expect things to be wonderful every time we go see something new. And there was a wonderful thing about that. I think I was very impressed by, at the beginning of the '97 version, we see the Titanic at the bottom, and we sort of start in present time and then go back. And those images where you see the broken ship at the bottom of the ocean, and it slowly turns into the mighty Titanic in the harbor there and at sea. And that was amazing at the time. You really felt like, oh my gosh, we're really going. And I think that's what Cameron did well. He went back and forth in time brilliantly, because we kept following, in a way, the ship was the main character. We kept following its fate and back to when it was at its very, very high. And those were wonderful. Those submarine images and photos. And you're so right about that little panorama sort of going over the deck and the little people. And that was just wow, the first time we watched that back in '97. That was wonderfully done. And then I think what what you have with a story like Titanic is people know what's going to happen. So we have braced ourselves emotionally before we start watching either film. It's a little bit like when you go to a concentration camp. You know this is going to be difficult, so you kind of brace yourself in advance. Um, and what that means is you know at one time it's gonna hit you.
Mm.
And whether it be during the screaming, whether it be a specific character we have followed for a while, and then, oh my God, they end up dying, or whatever it is, we know it's going to hit us at one point, and we're kind of waiting for that moment. And of course, it will be different points for different people. Um, but I do like that because it's a wonderful gift to have in a narrative to play around with that psychology. It means you can really create a whether you choose to go to fiction or you keep strictly to historical accounts, you can do a very personal and emotional and psychological portrait of an absolutely tragic event. And it's
Yes.
it almost tells its own story. You don't have to do an awful lot. And I think that was also why I felt a little, well, mixed feelings about the 97 version, because we didn't actually need that much of a love story. It's wonderful. And, Kate and Leo doing a great job, both of them. I was a teenager and we all fell in love with Leonardo DiCaprio because we had to. Wonderful times, but there was a feeling of, oh my God, this is going on forever, isn't it? And then she has to go down and rescue him and up again and running through water, an awful lot of running through water going on. But you don't really needed that. This was such a story in its own right. Um, and I think you're right. We probably feel a bit closer to the 97 version because it's in colors, the pictures are better, the story's a bit better told. They're also told in a present light. So perhaps a bit more like something we can relate to nowadays because it wasn't that many decades ago. And the story focus was very different back in the 50s. Um, but I do love that both films get that psychology behind the narrative because almost how could you not with a story like this?
That yes, and that's a really really well made point, Jane. And yes, I think that really central to what you were saying there is the reason why the 1958 film is still so highly regarded. I'll be interested to see what, in a few decades time, what people are saying about the 1997 film, but I have absolute confidence that the 1958 film has cemented its reputation forever. It will always be one of the greats. Although I say that the Library of Congress has branded Cameron's Titanic as being culturally significant and worthy of preservation. So, I
And
mean, that's a very authoritative statement of approval. So, I rate the Library of Congress higher than I do Academy Awards. So,
yeah,
uh,
no, but, and a fair point. It is a very, very well-made movie. It absolutely is, and I think he based a lot of it on both historical accounts, but also wasn't he allowed to dive? He was allowed.
yes, he did. He did go down to look at the wreck.
So, that,
So,
so those were actually his photos we were seeing. Those images.
yes,
Yes, yes. I remember
yeah.
that. That was a little, that was rare as well because you're normally not allowed to. How deep is it, Andrew?
She's about 2.5 miles down, possibly close to three. So it's a very long way. And okay, we hadn't had the accident with the Titan yet, but I'd had heard that even in the 80s when the wreck was first discovered, you were very aware of the risks you were running in going down to look at Titanic. And you had to be pretty sure you wanted to be there. I'll put it that way.
It's a long way. That is a long way. But there
Yeah.
were really wonderful images, and I like that we got to see those.
Yes, yeah. There is the book, Ballard's Discovery of the Titanic, which he published in the 80s. And there's a guy called Ken Marshall, an artist, and working from sort of photo mosaic, he has produced the most wonderful paintings of the wreck because he changes the light so you can appreciate the entire thing. Unlike really being down there, we have to go over it, foot by painstaking foot and try and build up in your mind what it looks like. And yeah, his paintings are well worth a look at. So, guys, some of you may already have this book, but The Discovery of Titanic by Dr. Robert Ballard. It's aged very well. Definitely worth a buy and a read.
Oh, that one. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, I'd also wanted to come back to the really good point you've made a few times about the love story and how necessary it is, because you're quite right with the historical characters. There are actually lots of love stories on Titanic. It's just not the Hollywoody kind of love. There's the Strausses where, Mrs. Strauss won't leave him because they've been through so much together. And she's one of a couple where we've had accounts of wives refusing to leave their husbands.
You only see a glimpse of them.
Yes, it's very inadequate for such an amazing, because that's the culmination of a decades-long love story. And if they'd given them just a few more scenes and a few more lines, you'd have had this beautiful old couple who were having a bit of a treat. There's one poignant bit again in Walter Lord's book where he talks about how Isidor Strauss, he'd written his will. And because his wife was such a lovely person, he'd said in the will, you need to be a bit more selfish and learn to enjoy yourself. So when I'm gone, use the money to have a bit of fun. And he'd booked the trip back on Titanic so she could have a bit of a treat. It was, and so it was a kind of a very sad side to it. But you also have the positive ones. You've got families who are reunited on the Carpathia. And there's incredible tales of love and commitment and willingness to you take a risk doing you'll do your best to survive because you want to see your family again, and there's all of those that could have been worked in and fleshed out as well.
It's been wonderful to maybe take one of those, that would have loved to, and maybe get separated on the Titanic in the chaos and meet up again afterwards. What a wonderful
Yes,
that would have been.
it would have been a good film still, because I think amid all the horror, you really need a happy ending. And Rose kind of has a happy ending in that her meeting with Jack sets her on this path to have a good life. But I'm not totally convinced they needed to kill him. It was all a bit contrived, really.
Wasn't there really any room on that door? Couldn't they have both fitted on that door?
They probably could. And actually, if when Jack could have tried a few other things. He could have tried to find another equally bit of wood. Rather than just hanging around for the sake of it. It's, Rose, I'll be back in 5 minutes. I'm just going to try and survive. Then we can spend the rest of our lives together. If I don't make it, then I tried. If I do make it, we spend the rest of our lives together. What's not to like? And see,
Yes.
if I was him, that's what I would have done. Because like you said earlier, boys my age in the 90s, we were expected to fancy Kate Winslet, which I can assure you was an absolutely terrible, terrible experience.
They after some amazing career. I think both of them that was probably their first sort of real major film, wasn't it? For both of them, it really was.
Yes, it was. Yeah, and I'm so glad that it launched the career of two really good actors. I mean, drifting off from Titanic, I still want to go and see Lee, which is Kate Winslet's latest film, which has been getting rave reviews.
And I'm glad to say, she's one of those actresses who's actually managed to keep working. There's always this gap when an actress, sadly not for men, but when an actress gets to a certain age, she kind of disappears for a while and then comes back playing the mother or the grandmother or something.
That does happen, yeah. And
she's kept going.
Yeah, and actually you're so right about that, because it's just reminded me that old Rose, and I think they really wanted to do this in the film, She is played by, I think it's Gloria Stewart, but don't quote me on that. So she was a very well-known actress during the golden age of Hollywood, sort of, 1950s, I think. And they wanted someone who was of that acting tradition and that era because she would carry herself as someone who had sort of known the aesthetic and the attitudes of at least the first half of the 20th century,
Yeah.
and be able to sort of play a modern person with memories of that past. And I think they chose well. I mean, I'm not sure what their other criteria was, other than they wanted someone who'd experienced Hollywood at that time.
Was a
But
sweet
yeah.
character.
Yes, and a great sense of humor
Yes.
too.
And she had that little, she could talk to those young men on the boats and sort of give them back, when
Yes,
yeah. So no, she was a nice character, and I mean, if it, I actually did like one of the fictional elements I did like was actually the present day scenes and the going back kind of thing, because
mm,
that added that layer of we are bracing ourselves now
yeah.
for this journey. So that I actually did enjoy. But yes, I'm still a bit. I'm still. There was a lot of love story going on. We could have cut that back by half an hour.
We could, and we didn't need it to be so dramatic. I mean, the bit where I slightly lost the will to live was when Cal loses his temper and
Yes.
steals the gun and then starts firing down the grand staircase. I thought, you really did not need that at all. And by this point, it was getting silly.
There was
Yeah,
there was that very long scene where Jack is chained somewhere down below and finding
yeah.
him. Oh, that went on forever. And I felt a bit like, okay, yeah, we have a ship sinking, guys. Could we go back to the sinking and maybe?
Yes, you're right. It's a massive disconnect, and it also slightly distorts your perspective on time a bit as well, because the rest of the narrative goes on at a fairly, appreciable pace. And I don't know if it's just me, but I found those scenes too long, too
Yes.
confusing, and and the bit where they find the child who's then rescued by his dad, and then they get swamped by the wave. Okay, you're trying to underline ongoing tragedy and hint at the people who are still trapped below. But I think we've had enough, we're getting enough tragedy by this point. You can just have a
Yeah.
um and I have a final objection around the love story, which is the number of times where it simply should not have happened. And I'm not just talking about what you rightly mentioned earlier, the divide between first class and third class. There are so many things that simply should not have happened. So Jack taking Rose to the bow of the ship, that
Yeah.
was very strictly a crew working
Yeah.
space, and for safety reasons the access stairs would have been roped off, so he shouldn't have been there. And you can see when he's doing his "Hey, I'm king of the world" thing, the bridge is right behind him, so the
Yes.
ship's
I've
senior
been
officers.
I've been thinking about that loads of time. They're just standing there watching him going, hey.
Yeah, it's like, oh, look at that guy. Yeah, it's like, no, actually, you get that bloody fool down before he kills himself, and possibly that young lady as well, who is quite well dressed. So we'll all be in lots of trouble if someone from
In
first
the
class.
very thin but pretty nightgown, someone go save that girl and put a jacket on her.
Yes, yeah, and even the scene where they meet, where she runs sobbing off to the rear of the ship. So if she really wanted to kill herself, she could have stayed in the first class area and just jumped off the side of the ship. It's actually totally unnecessary for her to, I mean, oh my God, enter the third class area.
That is like killing yourself, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Cameron. She, if she was a proper lady, she would have just cast herself off the boat deck and not bothered anyone, because people of that class don't make a fuss. It's just off. But no, she decided to wander all the way to the back of the ship. And I realize I'm nitpicking now, but my final objection to that scene is there's a position on that bit called the docking bridge. It's like that raised balcony that, when the ship was at sea, there were always at least one, but it should have been two or three people on lookout duty up there. Mm-hmm. And they would have had a completely unobstructed view of the rear of the ship. So there goes Rose in her bright red dress, sort of climbing up the rails and then hanging off the edge. Someone would have seen her and said, well, if they thought she was third class, they'd have said, "Oi, get off there!" Or if they realised she was a first class passenger, they'd gone, "I'm terribly sorry, madam, but I really don't think you should. Please don't."
Yes, that is a good point. I've been wondering about the bridge a lot of times because I've kind of gone, would they have also when he's standing there with his friend and they're doing the King of the World thing, you sort of go, would they have been allowed to do that? Or something?
No,
And
no, they
looking
would.
at the dolphins, you sort of go, really? Is that weird?
Yeah, because it does beg the question, if they're doing it, why are none of the other passengers doing it?
Yes.
The forecastle is as empty as it should have been when the ship
That
was at sea.
railing, if you had sort of perfect view from there, I would have been hanging out that railing.
Yeah, I would have too. And I have been on a couple of modern liners and I tried to venture to the equivalent part of those. And you're told very firmly for safety reasons, I'm terribly sorry, sir, you do not go there. It's crew only.
I never
So,
got that far because, as you said, it's always been roped off. You could never go anywhere near that.
no, you couldn't. So there's tiny little things that they took liberties with to enable the story to
But you
happen.
also have a good point, Andrew. Why not pick one of those love stories that were there? You could have embellished it a bit if you needed detail, yes. But if you had picked two people had been on board, that
Yeah.
would have been equally, and the Strausses, and you say that would have been equally powerful and given that same weight to
Yes.
that
Yeah.
aspect of it. And there were, as you say, there are elements to highlight all of. You had James Horner's their wonderful music. He died too early too, but wonderful,
Mm.
wonderful music there going with it. You have those beautiful, beautiful pictures. That you didn't need to do an awful lot. You didn't really need to give us an hour of extra fictional love story on top of this to make it dramatic.
Too much love story overall, I think. And while it's a good love story in the context of a Hollywood film, it would have been just as good somewhere else. I do have a question for you, Jane. Sort of touching on all the poor people who were shoved into the background by said love story. If there was a particular strand or a narrative or some people that if you could flesh them out at the expense of Rose and Jack, who would it be and why?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I um I would have probably had an element of a story going on somewhere. Um, I think, as you said, there are more realistic love stories we could have touched on than someone from the first class and steerage, really. But I would have loved to see two different aspects of this. For example, the Strausses, this very long, lifelong love story, him wanting to give her a treat, going a little bit into their story, and then, of course, their tragic ending. And then I would have loved a happy love story, maybe two people from steerage or something, two immigrants trying to make a better life for themselves in America, having heard about the greatness of this new country, the fantastic Titanic. We're actually boarding this wonderful new ship, being separated in the chaos and reunited, and all ends well. That I would have loved to see, because then you get both the tragic element and you get the uplifted element at the end, and you have at least someone who, oh my God, it ended well for them and they're building a new life in America. And that would have been Hollywood-ish as well, I guess. And then I would have loved, so yeah, that love story element, wonderful. Love is always good in a story, but I would also have loved to see a little bit more of the crew members, especially the officers, because I think that would have given a nice perspective. We already know about the differences between the classes and the divide there, but there is obviously also, as you pointed out with, for example, a character like Ismay, Andrew. Is he a passenger? Is he a member of the crew? There is also a passenger crew difference. And of
Mm,
crew members, as is natural, had different ranks as well. And
yeah.
they had different characters as well. There was a reason why someone like Murdoch was in his position. He was an experienced seaman as well, obviously not like Smith, but he was a great how to say, right hand man, I'm guessing, for Smith. He was a wonderful officer and an experienced officer to put responsibility on. And seeing that there were others as well in these sort of officer categories, seeing more of them and also obviously officers who survived and as we see came back and picked some of the passengers up in the water and so on, but seeing a bit more of their perspective, I think would have added a different parameter to the story as well, for for the dramatic effect, but also from the historical perspective, because I think right now they're sort of all crew members, different ranks, yes, but they're all crew members in a way. And I think there's a lot to flesh out there too that could have added some amazing perspectives to both the sailing, the engineering, the accuracy of the events, but also to the characters of the
Yes.
and the personality and the psychology of these people, or that group of people. So I think if I could, if let's say Jack and Rose had been two immigrants, maybe from Ireland, boarding the Titanic, trying to make for a better life, that would have been a wonderful love story as well. That maybe would have been a bit more realistic than the entire first class steerage.
Yes, yes. And there could have been a tragic arc to it, because they could have spent time talking about the horrible things they were leaving behind them and what tough lives they'd had up to, up to that moment, and possibly what challenges would be ahead of them as they slowly built a life in the new world.
And what another wonderful another dimension to looking at society as it was, with all the hardship that went on. There were a lot of people immigrating from all sorts of countries in Europe at the time. And we tend to forget that a little bit sometimes, that this was really harsh times for a lot of people. And there was a reason why so many, especially there was a reason why the steerage was the biggest group of passengers, because a lot didn't have a choice.
Yes, and it makes one feel very sorry for them, that really, when you look at how how the liner companies, all of them made their money, steerage was the profit margin. Your first class passengers might pay the equivalent of millions for in today's money for a first class suite, but you still get all the cumulative money from all these people buying third class tickets, which far outweighs your profit from first class.
It would have taken you years to get enough money to buy a third class ticket for Titanic.
Yeah.
It was a lot of money for people back then who didn't have anything.
Yes, yes, and I can see why it's such a disaster for those two Swedish men when Jack and Fabrizio win the card game. Although I do sometimes wonder, in those two fictional characters in later years, whether they'd sit in the same pub going, "Best card game I ever lost, that one."
But yeah, true, true. No, but wonderful question, Andrew. Oh my gosh, that is fantastic. What would you have done?
Oh, I would have actually left Titanic altogether, because better people than me have made this case in the past. But Carpathia, the first rescue ship on the scene, her story, it gets overshadowed by what happens to Titanic. But the response of her captain, Arthur Rostron, was absolutely epic. So as we know now, he's not the closest ship. By his best estimate, he's 4 hours away, which he suspects is going to be too long if things are as bad as the messages say they are. And so through the few hours that follow from them getting the message and confirming that there's a serious problem, he drives his ship recklessly fast through the same ice field that has fatally damaged Titanic, in darkness and everything. He drives his engines beyond their designed safety limit, and he takes all these risks that his colleagues would have probably criticized him heavily for. to shave off every second he humanly can. And everyone on the ship is affected because on a comfortable older liner like Carpathia, your engines, your boilers didn't just serve the engines. The steam power went into heating and minor machinery and passenger comfort. He has all of that shut down so that they can divert all the steam to the engines and squeeze all this extra speed out of the ship. And the end result is he still arrives too late, but he arrives much quicker than he would have done if he'd done it by the book. And I find the story of Carpathia that night and all the risks they ran. If he'd hit an iceberg and sunk as well, we would be vilifying him. What a complete moron. Why didn't you just, be a bit more careful? But he pulled it off. It's an amazing feat of seamanship. And someone else has said I think it was an article about the film, he said, Carpathia deserves her own movie with Titanic as an incidental player.
I was about to say, what a wonderful angle. What if you saw the Titanic tragedy from Carpathia's perspective?
Yeah. And you could really build it up emotionally because there'd be this constant strain of knowing that so many lives are depending on your decision and your actions. And you could build up on that emotional sense of, are we going to be in time? How many can we save? What can we do? And you could almost, and I think it was for them in reality as well. It was quite a shock at how few people they did end up saving. I mean, they saved a lot, but it was as a proportion of Titanic's crew, they weren't psychologically braced for those losses. And a few of them apparently were haunted afterwards by I'll call it a very unreasonable question, could we have done more? And the answer was, from my perspective, is absolutely not. You guys went above and beyond and pulled off one of the most amazing sea rescues ever. The problem is that your success is overshadowed by the fact that through no fault of your own, you were too late.
There is, in A Night to Remember, is there one or two tiny little scenes where we see from Carpathia or the Californian, I don't know which one it's meant to portray, but where we see they receive the distress signal, and they kind of can't believe it because is this from the Titanic, really? Yeah. I don't remember which one it is. I
think it's Carpathia, because initially there's disbelief because they go, it's the Titanic,
I remember thinking, we never saw that in Titanic, the 97 version, from any of their perspectives. We really, no. It's not until the very end that we see Rose being rescued, but we never really get to know what's going on there from when they receive the message.
Yeah. Yes, poor Carpathia. She turns up right at the end, and the only speaking part any of her crew gets is when the junior officer comes up to ask Rose her name, and she gives Rose Dawson.
That's actually a fantastic narrative perspective, Andrew. What if we saw the Titanic disaster from a little bit of a different angle?
Yeah.
It could also have been from, what about those people back in Ireland and everywhere else who had relatives on board the Titanic? And eventually the morning papers and the news would arrive. And you would sort of be waiting for news. Were they on the list or were they not?
Yes, and that would be a huge emotional roller coaster because as the rumor mill got going and conflicting reports trickle in, there's so much uncertainty and people spend days outside White Star's offices both in New York and in Britain, and it must have been horrible for them because you get these moments of hope. And when they finally start getting concrete information, I think the lists of losses and those saved are updated almost, every couple of hours. A new update is posted up, and to sit there waiting to see if you're going to see your loved one's name on the saved list or not. And what's really affecting, I find, is when they post the lists of the saved. you get these awful moments where if it's a couple, you'll sometimes get one person's name and not the other, and that's quite devastating. Yes, because none of the Titanic dramas really touch on the emotional aftermath or the fallout with the families. And
There is this mention of, all they could do now was wait to live, wait to die, wait for some sort form of, I don't know, clarity or something about the
yeah,
events, whatever happened. But you couldn't really do an awful lot. And there is a story in that. There's almost a new film in that as well, isn't there?
yes,
After,
yeah.
and the panic of the aftermath, and just also, I guess, trying to figure out what the devil happened. How could this go so wrong?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because the idea of a courtroom drama almost, because I mean, another successful movie, which we may well do one day, JFK, which,
That's
incredible film built around a courtroom investigation. The inquiries into Titanic's loss
yeah.
are full of drama and not a little bit of intrigue, because inevitably there's some people who I won't say they want to hide the truth. That's a bit too conspiracy theoristic, but they want to cover their backsides because there's a fear that they might be culpable in
There's
some of
a
the
range of
circumstances.
emotions. That's going to be guilt. That's going to be blame. There's going to be depression. There's going to be anger. There's going to be trying to find answers. That, yeah, as you say, that's
Mm,
going to be cover up. Partly because you don't want to remember certain things, and partly because you have to live with this now and try to find a way of changing the narrative in your head of what happened, or maybe about how brave or not brave you were yourself. There's going to be a whole range of narratives around that as well. We could do at least 15 new movies, Andrew.
good. Yes. Oh, there we go. We've got got this sorted, haven't we? And there's so, and sad to say, I'm afraid there have been liner disasters almost as long as we've had liners. And it's funny because Titanic isn't the worst one we've ever had, but her story overshadows them all because I think she was the first high impact one.
And
Um,
when there's a myth starting to emerge around, I mean, everyone has heard about the Titanic. Uh,
mm,
it's sometimes harder to look through to the facts when there are stories being added to stories. We call this in our world added history, and it's there is a truth in that, because we have the myth of the unsinkable ship, and it is a wonderful story, but it's also sometimes difficult. It makes it difficult to see through to the historical accuracy sometimes.
Yes, yes, and Titanic's myth grows in the telling very often. In the I think by the 40s and 50s, when Lord was starting to research his book, he found there was so much. When you asked people about Titanic, she was the largest ship in the world at the time, with by a couple of feet she was, but they made it sound like some people would even say she was a third longer than Olympic, which never was. Um, and the other thing that was exaggerated was the unparalleled luxury of the ship, which, okay, yes, she did set a new standard, but people were describing all sorts of ridiculous things, like the amount of gold in the first class staterooms was massively, massively overhyped, and how, even in steerage, they had these really wonderful things that other ships didn't have in their steerage accommodation. Like, let's just calm this down a tiny bit. And the biggest engines ever fitted into an ocean liner, which was not strictly true because they're, permutations. um, yeah, some people said she could go as fast as 30 knots, about 34, 35 miles an hour, which again, she never could. It was,
But another thing because it added to all of that, you mentioned, Andrew, another thing that added to the myth around her was also that she was incredibly well promoted. I mean, there'd been written stories about her, and then finally she launched. This was a fantastic marketing media stunt for the day. And that added obviously as well.
yes. And she was a pawn in the midst of a larger bit of very ferocious competition particularly between Britain and Germany, because Germany had got into the ocean liners game as well, and they did it well, to be fair. it almost paralleled the naval arms race that was raging between the two countries at the time, and there was this huge element of one-upmanship. So Titanic, in a way, was the latest effort in telling Germany to back off because we've got an even better liner now. And of course, almost immediately, the Germans were laying the keels of bigger and better ones. If she had not sunk, if there'd never been this whole, if she'd been like Olympic and just had a long and full career, I think Titanic probably would have just been a footnote in the broader glorious history of the transatlantic liner, because she would have been overshadowed within a couple of years by better ship. I mean, even her own sister ship, the third one, the Britannic, was even bigger than Titanic, and entered service a couple of years after she sank, was supposed to be even better, more luxurious. So
you almost return to that Captain Smith line. Well, Mr. Ismay, I believe you will get your headlines.
Yeah, yeah. And that it's so beautifully delivered. Yes, yeah. They did the casting. That Bernard Hill was
He
amazing
was
as Smith.
fantastic. He doesn't really get enough credit for this one, but he was fantastic. I actually do believe, what's his name, who plays Mr. Ismay? I've forgotten him now.
Crumbs, I can't remember now.
Someone will remember.
Guys, tell us who played Ismay.
He's actually doing a really good job too. I think in both movies. I don't know the name of the actor in A Night to Remember, but I actually think they both of them are doing a really good job. They're making him very different, but I think they're both of them giving him what he. I mean, we can disagree on how he's portrayed, but I do believe they do what they're meant to do with the role.
Yes, yeah, and it's a very good performance in both films. Yeah, well, Smith and Ismay, yes, I know what you mean about the different portrayal, but yeah, I think it's well done within the brief of the films, and especially as in the '97 film, where neither man gets as much airtime as they do in the 1958 film. Again, it's that silly young couple running around taking precious minutes up. Yes, because their relationship was more deeper and more complex and could have been explored in a lot more detail. So yeah, missed opportunity there.
Yes, in a way, yes, because it would have been interesting to also explore that hierarchy a bit, where you have the captain who's a captain, and Ismay does acknowledge that, but how much was he pushed, and how well could they, when they had these conversations, and they've obviously sat down and had lots of conversations, what sort of respect was there between the two men? How much detail did they go into? Where would Captain Smith have put his foot down, and so on and so on? There were lots of things between the two of them that could have been interesting as well. And we're going on and on now. Is it time we hand over?
I think it is. Everyone's been really patient with us while we've been diving deep into this one. So yeah, thank you guys. It's been really awesome. And Jane, thank you so much. It's been a brilliant conversation over 2 episodes. And
thank you, Andrew. This is awesome as always. And guys, join in. Let us know your favorite scene, your favorite line, your favorite movie. Are there things you disagree with us on this one? Please join in.
Yeah, actually, Jane, I really like that idea. Guys, even when you make your comment, if you decide to make a comment, even if it's just to vote, favorite film, Night to Remember or Titanic?
Yeah, good point. Oh, that's going to be a hard one.
I'd love to know what people think.
Yes, that is going to be a hard one.
Yes. And by the way, just to clarify, I mean the 1958 Titanic, not the terrible 1943 German film Titanic, because that really was not good.
No, not that one. Not that we
not
didn't.
That one.
That we
no.
didn't do that. I'm glad we didn't. Thanks so much, Andrew, and see you all next time.
Yes, looking forward to it, Jane. Catch you again soon, and thanks again.